for. Because it was an especially pivotal moment in terms of the development of a collective consciousness of students all over the country. And it was a pivotal moment in the development of student movements during that period. And as a matter of fact, it seems to me that every college and university campus in this country should find a way to reflect on that moment when vast numbers of students from all over the country, students of all racial, ethnic, national backgrounds, decided to spend their summer vacations in Mississippi and Alabama and Louisiana, confronting the violence of white supremacist forces. This was an experiment in collective courage, collective activism, unlike any other in the history of this country, except perhaps the literacy movement that took place immediately after the end of slavery. These were young people. These were teenagers, and some in their early 20s. I want to talk about this project for a few minutes, because it seems to me that sometimes young people today, and I'm not the kind of person who likes to preach about what young people don't do and don't know and ought to be doing. I never do that. At least I try not to. But I can say that we have all, not only young people, we've all been persuaded somehow that we lack the power to bring about major radical social change. And I think this has to do with the insidious and pervasive ideological influence of the worst kind of individualism. So much so that it becomes increasingly difficult to distinguish between individuality and individualism. So that many assume that to assert one's individuality, one must subscribe to a kind of neoliberal emphasis on individualism, on the notion that the individual is indeed the basic unit of society, which means that the individual supplants the social and the collective. And it's also a kind of possessive individualism, kind of bourgeois individualism, a kind of capitalist individualism. And it is therefore often assumed that if major change happens, it will be under the tutelage of a leader. A leader whom we can recognize when he or she, it's almost inevitably going to be he, it's not going to be she. A leader whom we can recognize as a model of the heroic individualism that most frequently undergirds any of our discussions of leadership. Now, popular representations of the history of the anti-racist struggle in the southern U.S. often focus on one leader, and we know his name, don't we? Don't we?
Yep.
And of course, as much as I revere figures like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., I am saddened by the way their representations have overshadowed the people who were the most important actors in those movements for radical change. It is as if representations of Dr. King stand in for, overshadow, and even erase the accomplishments of thousands of ordinary people. And of course, I'm talking about representational practices. I'm not talking about Dr. King himself, who always railed against the kind of individualism that would set him apart from the people with whom he struggled. Freedom Summer was organized by the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and also by CORE, Congress on Racial Equality. And you should know that reunions are taking place all over the country. And most of them are occasions for people to come together 50 years later. They're not necessarily publicized, and so we don't necessarily get to witness the conversations among those who spent that time in the South, especially during that summer. And of course, there are individual leaders associated with that movement. Some of us recognize the names, some names, and some of us don't. Bob Moses is probably the name most of us recognize. How many of you recognize the name of Bob Moses? And he was and remains the kind of, has a kind of quiet fierceness. And he continues to work for racial justice. Today, he is head of the Algebra Project, if anybody is interested in finding out how one can struggle for racial justice by emphasizing mathematics. That is the work that he does. It's really fascinating work. But what about Fannie Lou Hamer?
Yeah.
And then Ella Baker, and James Foreman, and Diane Nash. I could mention many other people. But what was so important about that particular summer was the fact that students from all over the country converged on the South, knowing how dangerous that work was, and engaged in the process of registering people to vote. And it's interesting because there were literacy laws in the South. As a matter of fact, the first time I attempted to register to vote in the town where I grew up, Birmingham, Alabama, I was not able to register because I was considered not literate enough. And I had already graduated from college. I already had a BA at the time. I tried to register. But what they did was to register those who knew how to read and write, and to create freedom schools in order to teach those who didn't, so that they would also be able to register to vote. That was the project of that summer. And Harry Belafonte describes what was envisioned by